I want to talk with you about the 7 surprises that I had, maybe kind of tips that I had in doing a solo cross-country flight. The first thing is my Magenta line tried to kill me. Now in ForeFlight, I had already planned a flight. I also had already put everything into the Garmin 430W inside the cockpit. And what happened is at the last minute, we decided to take the trip in reverse. As we did the flight, one of the things is I planned the altitude based on VFR flying conditions. And so we were flying along at 7,500, and as I start looking at the profile view inside of ForeFlight, I realized, wait a minute, if I fly just a straight shot, I'm gonna have to get up to about 11,500 feet, or I'm gonna have to not fly a straight shot and fly through some canyons a tiny bit. One of the surprises that I had was just, here I was planning on flying a direct route, just like I'd done on some of my other cross-country flights. And in this particular case, if I would have done that, it would have flown me right into the side of a hill. Deviating from those straight lines was something that I was not prepared for. I wasn't ready to actually kind of alter the course based on flying around the terrain and flying through large valleys rather than just flying that straight shot. So that was a bit of a surprise to me. The second thing that was a little bit of a surprise is airports are actually hard to find. Now, one of the things that's difficult right now is it's Southeast Idaho, everything is covered in snow. So that makes things difficult right off the bat. However, even though I knew exactly where the airport was supposed to be, as we're coming in, the runway was actually, it wasn't a very big runway, or not a very big airport. And so the runway looked a little bit like a road rather than a larger, like a Class D airport. And so that was a little bit of a surprise to me. I've noticed that in some other flights. But one of the things that I think people should be prepared for is these airports are sometimes hard to find if they're smaller airports, especially ones that you've never been to before. The third tip I'd give you is take time to visualize the approach. I've become so accustomed to flying my particular airports that are around me that when I flew into an airport that I was not very familiar with, I needed to take the extra time to visualize the approach. I knew what the weather was, I knew where the winds were coming from, and so I printed out the airport plate and I actually drew what my approach was gonna be, just so that wasn't something that I was trying to figure out in the air. That's my way of getting in front of the airplane, and I'd recommend that you do that as well. Closely related to that is tip number 4, which is fly the numbers, not the landmarks. Now, what that meant was, I actually came in on this one a little bit high. I'll talk about that here in a second, but I came in a little bit high, and so I actually aborted that particular landing, did a go around, and then came back in, really dialed in on the numbers. I would have been totally safe if I would have tried to land on that first landing, but I would have landed further down the runway because I was high. That's not being safe. And so for me, it really was a good reminder that you need to fly the numbers rather than the landmarks. The 5th tip that I have for you, and this is a no-brainer. You might look at it and be like, John, you're actually just kind of an idiot. But what it was is geography really changes weather. And in this case, I've already mentioned the fact that we were flying through some mountainous terrain, not massive mountains, and we only had a little bit of a crosswind as we were flying through the valleys. But one of the things that I had seen in some other videos is just how winds change when they come up over mountains. But there's other things around in our area, at least, where we've got some very dark terrain. It's actually some old lava flow that's in our area. And as you fly over some of these different terrain elements, the weather, the winds, the turbulence really change. And so, for example, as we were flying into one of the valleys, as we were coming from a flat valley or flat terrain into this particular valley, the turbulence really picked up, the wind started to shift around quite a bit. That's the first time I'd flown through that, and that was a bit of a surprise to me. So that next tip is be careful, or just be aware that when you change terrains, your conditions may change a little bit, especially your winds. The 6th tip that I have for you is really plan those winds aloft. Now, I know that when we do flight planning, that's built into this, but it's a totally different thing to start flying that route. For example, on this cross-country flight right here, we flew into a decent headwind, which means that our ground track was only about 80 knots, maybe 85. Coming back, we were going 130 knots. Now, what that meant was on the leg back, I had to land at a couple of different airports to satisfy the demands or the requirements for that cross-country flight. It meant that I had to get in front of the airplane and really plan for that top of descent. And thankfully, I was prepped for that. I was mentally ready for it and did all the math kind of ahead of time. But flying the winds aloft is very, very different than just looking at what they look like on paper. Be prepared for that. The last tip that I'll give you is manage your frequencies. And what I mean by that is you need to start creating a system for how you're going to juggle between the different frequencies. I was changing frequencies quite a bit. And what that means is I had to have a plan for when I change one frequency, I automatically load up the next frequency. Again, that's just ways that you stay in front of the airplane. I think that's half the reason that we fly cross-country flights, is to help us build those systems and build those processes to make sure that we are staying in front of the airplane. Those were some of the tips that I have, or maybe some of the surprises that I had. But that first one, I really wasn't ready for the fact that my Magenta line was actually trying to kill me. It was gonna fly me right into a mountain. And I hope that you learn from my experience and plan ahead for your cross-country flights. If you feel like the content is helpful, go ahead and subscribe. Also click the bell to be notified of when we release new content. We're releasing content about once a week, and we love to share that experience of becoming pilots ourselves. Thanks for joining us here at Pilot Pursuit. We'll see you on the next video.